Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is Module 5. So all I want to do, this will be very short, but I want to talk to you briefly sort of about the history of these social programs. Now, there are a lot of nuances. Not all social programs are created equally, but I want to talk about the ACA a little bit, Affordable Care Act, and universal health care, because as we discussed in the second module when we talked about the current state of affairs, we talked about the controversy behind the ACA. And then as we got into Module 3 and we talked about some implied powers from the Constitution, and then we got into Module 4 and I brought up this idea of socialism versus capitalism. And the whole idea there was just to make you aware of what socialism is and why it's a touchy word in the United States historically. So that kind of brings you up to date with what we covered. But what I want to cover in this module is basically I want to say that the ACA certainly isn't the first social program that's been accused of being a socialist initiative. So we can go all the way back. So right after the Constitution was ratified, if you look at 1792, there was a Militia Act, and some people point to this as something that is sort of like the individual mandate in the ACA because it forces citizens to do something. So the Militia Act is really interesting because militia means like informal army, if you will, and George Washington wanted every white male that was between the ages of 18 and I think 45 should own a musket, or that's like an old-fashioned rifle. So some people point to that as being one of the first social programs because it was a demand put onto people that they had to purchase something. Now, Washington considered that an act of self-defense against the British, so that's why that was in place. Again, it's not exactly the same as an individual mandate, but it's really cited by historians as one of the first acts where the government is imposing something on the citizens. And then after the Militia Act, this one's closer to home. There was an act for the relief of sick and disabled seamen and sailors, and that was passed by the Fifth Congress, back in 1798, and that was signed into law by President Adams, and that's closer to the ACA really because the impetus behind this one was to provide healthcare services and hospitals, a lot cruder than what we have today, of course, but to provide those for sailors and seamen. And it was very similar to the ACA. There was going to be a deduction out of sailors' paychecks in order to fund this, and they had to participate in it. Now, again, people will argue this wasn't as much of a social program as it was a national defense program because all of the commerce, all the transportation back then was by sea, and if the sailing fleet was unhealthy, then that would hurt the national economy, and it also could jeopardize defense because of the Navy. So that was a mandatory program to provide healthcare services to a specific group of individuals, in this case, merchant marines or sailors. So there is some historical precedent to this, and the reason I bring it up, and I'll bring up another one that happened in 1854. President Franklin Pierce at that time vetoed an act that Dorothea Dix brought forward, and that was an act where she wanted to provide schools and property to build institutions for the mentally ill. Dorothea Dix was a historical figure who was an advocate for those with mental illness, and Franklin Pierce, the president at the time, vetoed this bill that was coming through Congress because he really felt that local or the government shouldn't have that much. The federal government shouldn't impose that up on the workers now, or impose that upon the citizens. So the irony there is, even though Franklin Pierce wouldn't sign the bill that would give land to organizations who wanted to build hospitals for the mentally ill, we did give land to the railroads to build railroad tracks across the country. So it kind of shows you that capitalism and business was more important than healthcare all the way back to 1854. Now, you're going to read a lot about the New Deal. You're going to wonder what that is. So the New Deal is something that happens during the Great Depression. So that's in the 1930s. The president is Franklin Roosevelt. And the New Deal is important here because the New Deal really marks the beginning of some modern social programs. So Social Security, which is still in place today, was a New Deal program. And that was very controversial as well. There was a lawsuit over it in the Supreme Court called Helvering versus Davis, and it talked about this idea that it's unconstitutional to force people to participate in Social Security. So most of you know Social Security is a program that provides money for you after you retired, assuming that you've worked your entire life. And again, that's a social program in a sense, but a lot of people feel that it isn't because the government isn't technically redistributing money. You're putting money into the Social Security program out of your paychecks. Same with Medicare, not Medicaid, but Medicare. And that money is redistributed to you when you need it. And it's not exactly that clean, but it sort of is. So a lot of people will argue that Social Security really isn't technically a social program because you actually have to put money into it. On the flip side of that, people will argue that Social Security is a socialist type program because you have no choice but to participate in it. So there's all sorts of debates out there. The reason I bring this up is I just want you to know that historically over time, anytime there's been a new federal government program like Medicaid, like Social Security, like Medicare, any of these programs, they've always been controversial. And if you look at the social history of this, they're controversial, especially at the beginning. But once people get used to them, they're very well accepted. And actually, usually in a period 5 to 10 years after these federal programs are introduced, if you try to take them away, there's a lot of controversy. Now, that's also true with the ACA. Prior to the passage of the ACA in 2010, less than half of the public was behind this idea of some sort of national health insurance program through the Affordable Care Act. But after it was put into place, especially like right now, 60 to 70% of the people think that there should be some sort of national health care and are favorable to the ACA. So once people get used to something and they understand the benefits, normally their position changes. So I just want to let you know that there's a history of controversy in these social programs, but once we get used to them as a society, they're pretty hard to take away from people. So consider that, and in the next module, we're going to start to look at these debates in more detail. Thanks.